young Irish mother stood outside a quiet brick building in New York. She handed her newborn baby, along with her entire life savings, to a well-dressed woman at the door. She believed she was securing a bright future for her child with a wealthy family. She walked away thinking she had made the ultimate sacrifice for love. In reality, she had just paid for a quiet execution. This is the hidden story of the maternity boarding houses of the Gilded Age. The women who profited from despair, and the single mother who finally tore their system down. The Gilded Age in America was an era defined by its sharp and unforgiving contrasts. While industrial magnates constructed sprawling mansions along Fifth Avenue, an entirely different reality festered in the shadows of Lower Manhattan. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants poured into the city every year, hoping for prosperity but finding themselves trapped in the crushing poverty of tenement districts. They worked brutal hours for meager wages, navigating a world that offered very little mercy to those who stumbled. For a young, unmarried immigrant woman, the margins of survival were already perilously thin. A pregnancy out of wedlock did not merely bring private shame. It guaranteed absolute, irreversible ruin. Society in the late 19th century offered no grace to a fallen woman. The moment her condition became visible, she would be swiftly dismissed from the factory floor or the domestic kitchen, where she earned her keep. Her own family, terrified of the neighborhood's harsh judgment and unable to afford another mouth to feed, would frequently cast her out into the street. Even the church, meant to be a sanctuary, turned its back on her sin. She was left entirely alone, carrying a child in a city that forgave nothing and provided for no one. Desperation always creates a market, and the bustling streets of New York quickly provided a quiet, insidious solution. Hidden in the back pages of local newspapers, slipped discreetly between advertisements for patent tonics and dry goods, were small printed notices. They offered services of what were called maternity boarding houses or lying-in hospitals. These establishments marketed exactly what a ruined girl needed most. They promised absolute secrecy. They offered a hidden room where a young woman could deliver her baby away from the judging eyes of the world. And more importantly, they offered a way to make the problem disappear entirely. The reality of this underground system was a highly profitable and entirely unregulated business. As thoroughly documented in 1872 by the prominent American social reformer Charles Loring Brace, the proprietors of these houses operated on a ruthless financial model. The women who ran these establishments, often styling themselves as benevolent nurses or skilled midwives, charged a flat, lump sum fee to take the newborn off a mother's hands forever. The cost typically ranged from $10 to $50. They would look the frightened, exhausted girls in the eye and make a profoundly comforting promise. They swore that the infant would be swiftly adopted by a loving, affluent farming family in the countryside, far away from the filth and disease of the city slums. For a young girl working in the needle trade, bringing home barely enough to survive after long hours of bent, bone-eating piecework, a fee of $25 was an astronomical sum. It represented the painstaking accumulation of her entire life's savings, hidden away coin by coin in the dark corners of a shared tenement room. Yet, she paid it without hesitation. She handed over the crumpled bills to the proprietor, and then she handed over her own flesh and blood. The mother would walk back out into the cold streets of New York with empty arms and a shattered heart. She absorbed the quiet agony of separation, sustained only by the desperate belief that she had just sacrificed her own happiness to buy her child a chance at a decent life. There was a great deal the newspaper advertisements did not say. She had no way of knowing that her love had been weaponized, or that she had just financed an industry built entirely on a lethal illusion. The days that followed her surrender were measured in the rhythmic, deafening clatter of the textile looms. The young mother returned to the factory floor, blending back into the anonymous rows of immigrant women hunched over their grueling work. Her hands moved with practiced, mechanical speed, threading bobbins and guiding rough fabric under heavy iron needles. But her mind remained tethered to the quiet brick building she had left behind. Her body still ached with the immediate physical aftermath of birth, a pain she was forced to swallow in a workplace that allowed no breaks for grief or recovery. Yet, it was the hollow, lingering weight in her empty arms that proved the hardest burden to endure. She told herself, over and over, that her child was safe, wrapped in clean linen, waiting for a carriage that would take it to the promised fresh air of the farming countryside. It was the only fragile thought that made the suffocating heat of the factory bearable. But the harsh logic of survival is often no match for the primal instinct of a mother. As the weeks dragged on, the desperate comfort of her sacrifice began to crack under the weight of separation. A creeping, nameless anxiety took deep root in her chest. She found herself scanning the tired faces of passing women holding infants in the streets, haunted by the features of the child she had only briefly been allowed to hold. Driven by an intuition she could no longer silence, she decided she could not wait in the dark. She did not want to disrupt the arrangement or demand her money back. She only wanted a single, fleeting glimpse of her baby to assure herself that the woman's promise had been kept. Risking her meager wages and her employment by leaving her station in the middle of the day, she made the long, anxious walk back through the crowded, soot-stained streets of the city. When she finally arrived at the familiar heavy wooden door and knocked, the reception she received was entirely different from the day she brought her money. The proprietor, the well-dressed woman who had previously offered such warm smiles and maternal comfort, opened the door only a fraction. The carefully practiced facade of benevolence had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. When the young mother pleaded just to see her child for a moment, the woman's demeanor turned instantly hostile. She stepped out onto the threshold, physically blocking any view of the interior, and her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. She reminded the terrified girl of the exact terms of their arrangement, making it clear that her rights as a mother had been forfeited the moment the cash changed hands. Furthermore, she threatened to summon the police for trespassing and, worse, to publicly expose the girl's shameful secret to her employer and her deeply religious neighborhood if she did not leave immediately. The proprietor knew exactly how to weaponize the young woman's deepest fears against her. Defeated, exhausted, and trembling from the threat of total ruin, the young mother stepped back toward the street. But in that brief moment before the heavy door was slammed in her face, she caught a glimpse past the angry proprietor and into the dimly lit hallway of the boarding house. The doors to the back parlors were left slightly ajar to let in the stifling city air. She could clearly see the edges of at least a dozen wooden cribs lined up tightly against the peeling wallpaper. There were small forms in them, wrapped tightly in soiled blankets. Yet, standing there frozen on the threshold, the mother noticed a detail that chilled the blood in her veins. In a crowded tenement house filled with over a dozen abandoned, isolated newborns, there was an absolute unnatural silence. Not a single baby was crying. Once the heavy door closed and the $25 disappeared into a proprietor's pocket, the promised future vanished with it. The reality of baby farming was dictated entirely by a set of grim, brutal mathematics. Caring for a newborn requires milk, warmth, medicine, and endless hours of labor. Every penny spent on nourishing the child was a penny subtracted from the woman's profit. Because the arrangement was based on a single upfront payment rather than a recurring wage, the financial incentive was completely inverted. To a baby farmer, a living child was a growing financial liability, while a dead child meant the margin of profit was maximized. The most efficient way to keep the money was simply to stop feeding the infants altogether. This was not an isolated tragedy confined to a single boarding house in Lower Manhattan. It was a systemic horror operating quietly in the shadows of the nation's rapidly expanding urban centers. Historical public health data collected between 1870 and 1910 painted a staggering picture of this underground economy. Across major American cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, the mortality rate inside these specific maternity boarding houses reached an unimaginable 80 to 90%. The infants were stripped of the names their mothers had given them and placed in crowded, unventilated back rooms. They died slowly and painfully from severe malnutrition, deliberate neglect, and devastating intestinal infections brought on by the filthy environment. On the rare occasions they were given nourishment, it was often heavily watered down or soured milk. Their incredibly brief lives were spent in soiled linens, their small bodies gradually shutting down as the proprietors waited patiently for the inevitable end. The sheer scale of the death toll required a reliable method of disposal, and the Gilded Age city offered the perfect cover. The slums of the late 19th century were overcrowded, chaotic, and vastly under-policed. When an infant finally succumbed to the harsh conditions, the baby farmers faced almost no legal or medical scrutiny. They easily forged death certificates, sometimes bribing corrupt local officials or relying on indifferent doctors to list vague natural causes like general weakness or the common summer complaint. In many instances, the proprietors bypassed the bureaucratic paperwork entirely. Small bodies were simply disposed of under the cover of darkness, left in the city's overflowing rivers, dark alleyways, or municipal ash dumps. The local authorities rarely devoted resources to investigate the disappearance of an illegitimate child who officially belonged to no one. Yet, the everyday mechanics of this dark industry presented one massive logistical flaw. Starvation is a desperate, agonizing physical process, and a boarding house filled with neglected infants should have echoed with cries, loud enough to draw the attention of every passing neighbor and beat cop in the tightly packed tenement district. The proprietors needed a highly effective method to ensure total silence from their victims, and the medical market of the era provided them with a perfectly legal, lethal tool to accomplish it. The unnatural silence that filled the hallways of these boarding houses presented a profound logistical mystery. Starvation is an agonizing, desperate physical process that should have echoed with cries loud enough to alert every passing neighbor, landlord, and beat cop in the tightly packed tenement districts. A dozen neglected infants left in a single room would normally create a chorus of distress, impossible to conceal from the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan. The proprietors needed a highly effective, deeply discreet method to ensure total silence from their victims, avoiding any unwanted attention that could disrupt their profitable enterprise. The unregulated medical market of the late 19th century provided them with a perfectly legal, highly accessible, and profoundly lethal tool to accomplish exactly that. The answer to the chilling quiet was found in a small, ubiquitous glass bottle known as Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. First introduced to the American public in the mid-19th century, it had become an absolute staple in millions of households by the height of the Gilded Age. The widespread newspaper advertisements painted a picture of ultimate domestic tranquility. The tonic was aggressively marketed to exhausted well-meaning mothers, and frantic nurses as a miraculous modern cure for the common pains of infant teething, dysentery, and general childhood restlessness. It was sold cheaply for 25 cents at every local apothecary and general store, guaranteeing a peaceful night of rest for both the anxious mother and her suffering child. The reality of this supposed miracle cure was a devastating lesson in the dangers of unregulated chemistry. Long before the era of federal oversight and the establishment of modern drug laws, patent medicines were allowed to conceal their exact formulas from the public. The sweet-tasting liquid hidden beneath the comforting, motherly label was essentially a potent mixture of pure alcohol and massive, unmeasured doses of morphine sulfate. A single teaspoon contained enough raw opiate to heavily sedate a fully grown adult. For a newborn, especially one already weakened by severe malnutrition, the chemical impact was immediate, overwhelming, and catastrophic. In the hands of a baby farmer, this everyday household medicine was swiftly repurposed from a misguided remedy into a deliberate, calculated weapon. The proprietors understood the brutal efficiency of the drug. A comatose child required no expensive milk, demanded no physical attention, and, most importantly, made absolutely no noise. They systematically overdosed the infants left in their care, pouring the thick syrup down their throats at regular intervals throughout the day and night. The heavy doses of narcotics immediately suppressed the infant's central nervous systems, plunging them into a deep, unshakable stupor. It was a terrifying method of crowd control that doubled as a mechanism to accelerate the intended fatal outcome. The syrup did far more than just keep the boarding houses quiet. It actively masked the agonizing physical symptoms of severe malnutrition, while simultaneously suppressing the children's natural instinct to cry out for survival. The heavy opiate intoxication depressed their respiratory systems to dangerously low levels, making their breathing shallow and irregular. The emotional reality of this practice remains one of the darkest, most heartbreaking chapters in the history of American child welfare. These forgotten infants did not merely waste away from the slow deprivation of food and basic human warmth. They died quietly in deep, chemically induced comas, their tiny chests eventually slowing to a complete halt without ever making a single sound. They slipped away in the dark, suffocating back rooms of the city, completely subdued by the very medicine that was advertised to soothe and protect them. The absolute stillness that the young Irish mother had noticed while standing desperately in the hallway of that Lower East Side boarding house was not the comforting peace of a well-tended, sleeping nursery. It was the heavy, fatal silence of poison. The young Irish worker walked away from the heavy wooden door, but she did not return to the deafening clatter of the textile mill. The threat of total social ruin had been wielded against her like a weapon. She knew that exposing her secret meant losing her meager wages, facing the harsh condemnation of her church, and enduring the permanent disgrace of her family. Yet, none of those fears could override the crushing, unnatural silence she had just witnessed in that dark hallway. The maternal instinct that had driven her back to the boarding house now pushed her toward an unthinkable rebellion. She refused to be silenced by the shame of her circumstances. She began to search the unforgiving streets of New York, a desperate, exhausted woman looking for any authority, willing to listen to the frantic claims of an unwed immigrant. The local police precincts of the Gilded Age rarely concerned themselves with the illegitimate children of the working poor. But fate and the shifting, moral conscience of the era offered her a profoundly different avenue. She eventually found her way to a newly established office that had just opened its doors. In 1874, the escalating horrors of urban child abuse had sparked a radical legal movement, leading directly to the creation of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It was an entirely unprecedented institution. The NYSPCC stood as the very first formal child protection agency ever established in the world. It was designed specifically to intervene in the dark corners of the city, where the traditional law refused to look, acting as a powerful shield for those who possessed absolutely no legal voice of their own. She sat before the officers and poured out the entire hidden truth. She told them about the $25, the well-dressed woman, the comforting promises of an affluent farming family, and the terrifying, motionless cribs. The agency did not dismiss her account as the hysterical ramblings of a fallen woman. Armed with newly minted silver badges and the unprecedented legal authority to break down doors to save a child, a team of NYSPCC investigators immediately marched back to the Lower East Side. They arrived at the brick building and did not wait for an invitation. They forced the heavy front doors open, physically pushing past the suddenly terrified proprietor, and stormed directly into the stifling back parlors of the establishment. The scene waiting for them behind the peeling wallpaper was a nightmare of systematic, calculated neglect. The investigators found room after room filled with rows of small wooden cribs shoved tightly against the walls. The air inside the boarding house was thick with the sickeningly sweet scent of alcohol, stale sweat, and severe decay. Dozens of empty glass bottles of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup littered the floorboards and side tables, the sticky, dark residue of morphine still clinging to the rims. In the cribs lay the emaciated, unresponsive victims of the proprietor's brutal financial arithmetic. The young mother followed the investigators inside, frantically searching through the silent rooms. Her hands shook violently as she pulled back soiled blankets, desperately looking for the familiar face of the newborn she had surrendered weeks ago. The devastating realization finally crashed down upon her in that suffocating space. Her child was nowhere to be found. Already absorbed into the city's dark, anonymous disposal network, lost forever to the lethal efficiency of the baby farmers. The carefully constructed illusion of the benevolent maternity clinic was completely shattered. The investigators dragged the proprietors out of the dark rooms and into the chaotic daylight of the immigrant district. They were led away through the crowded streets in iron handcuffs, their lucrative enterprise brought to a sudden, absolute end. The intervention of the NYSPCC ensured that this raid did not remain a quiet, localized scandal. By the following morning, the glaring lights of the New York press had illuminated the entire underground industry. The same influential newspapers that had once quietly profited from printing their discreet advertisements now splashed the horrifying details of the baby farms across their front pages. The desperate final act of one ruined mother had forced a wealthy, indifferent city to look directly at the staggering cruelty it had allowed to flourish in the dark. The explosive newspaper coverage following the raid left the politicians of New York with nowhere to hide. The graphic descriptions of the silent, crowded rooms on the Lower East Side horrified the public and ignited a fierce, undeniable demand for justice. Forced into action by the sheer weight of public outrage, the state legislature moved with uncharacteristic speed. They enacted strict, sweeping laws requiring formal licensing, extensive record-keeping, and rigorous health inspections for any facility claiming to care for infants. The unregulated, shadow era of the maternity boarding house was suddenly and permanently dragged into the unforgiving light. This localized scandal marked the beginning of the end for the baby farming industry in America. The successful intervention by the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children proved that the law could be used as an active instrument of compassion. Their pioneering investigative model quickly spread across the country and eventually across the globe. It forced a fundamental, permanent shift in how the modern world viewed its youngest and most vulnerable citizens. Children were no longer treated as easily disposable property or a private family burden, but as individuals entitled to fundamental legal rights and state protection. Yet, at the very center of this monumental historical shift stands the quiet figure of an unnamed Irish textile worker. She walked away from that scandal, having lost absolutely everything a woman of her time could lose. Her meager life savings were gone. Her reputation was irreparably destroyed by the public exposure of her illegitimate pregnancy. Most devastating of all, her child was dead, a forgotten victim of an industry built entirely on greed and illusion. But her desperate refusal to stay silent in the face of absolute social shame changed the course of legal history. The profound courage of a ruined, grieving mother ultimately forged a legal shield that would protect millions of children in the century that followed. Historical true crime often focuses on the terrible acts of notorious figures, but it also reminds us of a deeper, more enduring truth. The greatest and most lasting changes in human law often begin with the quietest voices of grief. If a story like hers stays with you, that is reason enough to keep telling it. I would love to hear your thoughts on how far child protection has come since the Gilded Age in the comments below. If you would like to help bring more of these forgotten historical cases back to light, you can support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more.